Hey guys, welcome to this lesson on how the input function works in Auditorium. Now, this is an important lesson because inputs actually work a little bit differently in Auditorium compared to what you have seen so far elsewhere. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that in exercises that require an input, the input pane will show up on the bottom left. And here, occasionally, I might start you off with some example inputs, but if you see the input pane, you can always delete what I've written in there and replace it with your own, or write multiple lines of inputs. But how does it work exactly in Auditorium? Well, it's mostly used for us to be able to test your code, to be able to see that you're writing the correct code and to make sure that you're on the right track. So let's take a look at how inputs work in a little bit more detail. Take a look at the code that I've written here. Print, and then the input function, and then closing the print statement. Go ahead and run this code and see what gets printed in the output area. Can you see where it comes from in the input pane? Now notice how I've added two more of these lines of code. Now, if you go ahead and run this code now as it is, you should see all three names in the input area printed into the output area. So the way that input functions work in Auditorium is that you can go line by line from top to bottom in the input area, and as long as you write the input function, so the word input plus the opening and closing parentheses, it will look in the input area and pick out each one line by line. But now we have an interesting problem. What if I have four of these lines of code to try and pull in four inputs, while if you take a look in the input area, there are clearly only three lines of inputs, Jane, Ben, and Tom. There is no fourth input line. So what happens here? Well, if you go ahead and run this code, you will see an error. And this is where you're trying to pull in an input that doesn't exist in the input pane. So if you familiarize yourself with these errors, then if it does happen in the future, you'll know exactly what's going on. So when you do see that end of line, then you'll know that, oh, maybe I've added one too many inputs and it doesn't actually exist in the input pane. Now, the final thing I want to mention is, unlike previously when you've been writing Python for your projects, when you use the input prompt, because we don't need the prompt in order to get hold of the input, this prompt actually goes into the output next to the input name. So when you run the code here, as you see right now, you will see the words, "What is your name?" ? And then immediately the first line of the input. Now, this is not what we want to do on the Auditorium coding exercises because we're testing your outputs to make sure that you're getting the right results from your code. So in all cases, when you're using the input in Auditorium, I recommend to use it without any prompt text. So simply the keyword input, an open parentheses, and a closing parentheses, and that entire block will be replaced by whichever input you have in the input pane. Now take a look at this demo coding exercise. Now, without changing any of the code in main.py, go ahead and simply click on the submit button and run all of the tests that we prepared for this exercise. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the code should pass all of the tests in the evaluation pane. But notice in the input area, you only see two numbers. So the code here on line 4 multiplies number 1, which comes from the first line of the input area, by number 2, which comes from the second line of the input area. Now, in order for us to be able to test your code to make sure that you're doing the right things, we will add hidden inputs and hidden tests. So when you run the code, you will see other tests being run in addition to the input of 2 times 3. This way, we can ensure that your code is actually code and it's doing what it's supposed to do and it covers all of the corner and edge cases. Now, notice what happens if a student completes the exercise without actually completing the objectives of what we're testing them on. So in this case, we're pulling in number 1 from line 1 of input, which is 2, and we're pulling in number 2 which is 3, and then we simply printed 6 on line 4, because I know very easily that 2 times 3 is 6. Now, however, if you go ahead and click on the Submit button, without, again, changing any of the code in the demo, then you'll see that one of the tests pass, but the other one fails. And this is because that the first test case is 2 times 3, which does equal 6. So your output from your code is 6, and the expected output is also 6. So that works just fine. Now, however, in the second test case, this doesn't pass because we're printing the output 6, whereas we've got some hidden inputs testing your code against the inputs 5 and 5. 5 times 5 is 25, and 6 does not equal 25, and that's why the second test fails. Now, you might think to yourself, well, how can I write code that works for all of these test cases? Well, you would have to write actual code like what you saw in the previous slide, which takes in any input and doesn't care what number it is and simply multiplies the first number by the second number. So head back over there if you're confused and see if you can fix this slide so that all the test cases pass. Now, try it yourself. Try pulling in some of the inputs from the input area. So look at the input pane at the bottom left. Go ahead and change the values that are in there. You can add as many lines of input as you want. And then try writing some code in main.py in order to print the different lines of input into the output area. If you get stuck, look back at the previous slides to see how you can pull in the input using the input function. Now, in the final coding exercise of this lesson, I want you to figure out how to pull in the inputs and calculate the number of letters in the names that I put into the input. Now, just before we do that, I want to show you how you can actually get hold of the number of letters from a piece of string in Python. So the function in Python is called len, which stands for length, and you can use len and then a set of parentheses, and then inside the parentheses add some text, such as what you see here on line 1, and when you print the result of that, you will see the number of letters in that text being calculated. Go ahead and hit run code and see this for yourself. So now you're finally ready to tackle the final coding exercise of this lesson. So take a look through the instructions, the hints, and see what we're expecting you to get as an output. So the task for today is to pull in the text from the input area. There will only be one line of inputs, and this will be a name. So you can see in the starting example, I put my name in there, and your job is to write some code in main.py in order to print out the number of letters in the name that's put in the input. Now, of course, remember what I mentioned before. When we're testing your code, we're going to pass your code with inputs that I have hidden away. So when you submit the code, when you think you're ready, you will see different inputs being passed through main.py. And your code has to work for all of them. So make sure you're writing code and you're not just simply calculating it using your head. And that way you'll be able to pass all of the tests in the evaluation pane. So give this a go, and if you get stuck, there's always the next slide where I'll go through the code solution, but also you can head back a few more slides previously and see if you can figure out the solution yourself. Now we're going to break down the solution into 3 distinct parts. And the first part is the input function. The input function can bring in the value that's in the input pane. So that's the first part we need to get hold of. Now that we've gotten hold of the text on the first line of the input pane, then we need to put it inside the len function. So as I showed you earlier, the len function can take any piece of text and tell you how many characters or how many letters are in that piece of text. So in this case, we're simply inserting what we got from the input into the len function in order to perform this functionality and let us know how many letters are in the input text. Now, of course, when you saw it before, you simply saw len, and then in the parentheses, we added in plain text. But in this case, we're writing our code to perform things automatically, and it has to work for all of the different inputs, not just for the word Bertrand. So in this case, we're taking the input and putting it inside the len function so that it'll work even if we switch out the input with any other name. Now, the final part is to put all of that into the print statement. So remember, inputs go into the part between the parentheses. So now we have a complete program where we first take the input, we put it into the length function, we calculate the length of the string in the input, and then we put that into the print statement and we print it out into the output area. So each of these functions had a distinct role, and by putting them one into the other, we end up with the result we want. Now, if you got stuck or if you had any differences in your code, feel free to go back to the previous slide and update it now. As long as you understand exactly what's going on here, because there's several steps involved, then I'm happy that you have mastered the art of the input function.